Okay, welcome to After Effects. For this lecture, we're going to we'll go briefly over the interface for After Effects and start on one of the exercises, introducing you to creating keyframes and adjusting easy ease, or creating easing on your keyframes. So when you first open up After Effects, there should be a dialog box that appears. Depending on what other projects might have been worked on the same computer or the After Effects file at the time, you may have previous projects listed here. But it's not really going to matter too much unless you want to open up an old project. Instead, we're going to be creating a new one. You can actually do that by hitting New Project or hitting the X button. It actually doesn't really matter at this point. If you did not get a dialog box, you need not worry for that reason. I'm going to hit New Project, and either way, it's going to make the dialog box go away, and your screen should look something like this. You should have a composition panel towards the middle, and this is going to be where we're going to be viewing our footage, our videos, as we're creating them. Right now we don't have anything just yet, other than the option to create a new composition or to create a new composition from footage. At the bottom we're going to have a timeline. On the left side is where we're going to be placing our layers, and on the right is going to be the layers duration on the timeline, including the timeline itself, which is going to vary depending on our settings in composition. On the left side, we're going to have the projects bin, and that's going to be any compositions that we make will be listed here, as well as anything you import from an outside source. So any graphics, videos, sound files. We're not going to be importing anything for this lecture, but if you did import, it would go under the project bin. On the right side, you may have a variety of different little screens here. We're not really going to need most of them right now. If I were to put up any, then I would say maybe preview. But it's not essential to have this anything in particular up on the right side. So we're going to create a new composition by clicking on New Composition right here on the left, or click up here at the top where it says Composition and clicking on New Composition. Might look a little different if you're using a Windows computer, but the location should be similar. So once you hit New Composition, a new dialog box will appear. For composition name, we're going to call it Exercise 1. Underneath, you have presets, many presets to choose from, but HDTV 1080-24 is a good one to use if you want to set this up very quickly. Alternatively, what it refers to is that's going to be 1920 by 1080, which is the standard HDTV size of today, the 1080 size. We're going to have square pixels. The frame rate is 24 frames per second. For resolution, we're just going to go with full. This has to do with the look of the animation or the graphics while we're working on them, not what they will look like once they're exported, just while we're working on them. If your file is running slow or your computer struggles with After Effects, then you're going to want to go with third or quarter. The graphics will look more pixelated or grainy, but it doesn't mean anything's wrong. It just means that it's viewing it at a lower resolution so that your computer can work quicker. For the start time code, we're going to want 0, and for duration, we're going to want 5 seconds. Now I know this looks like 5 minutes, but the far right numbers, these two numbers, refer to the frames, not the seconds. So this second set of numbers from the right refers to the seconds, not the minutes. And then these are the minutes, and then this is the hour. So if we want it to be 5 seconds, I know this looks like 5 minutes, but this is how we would want it to be set up. Now, if you want it to be 5.5 seconds, let's say, then that's going to be based on the frame rate, which is why this over here says base 24. So this would be based on 24 frames per second. So if we did want it to be 5.5 seconds, we would want it to be 512. If you want it to be 5.25 second, we would want 506, because 6 times 4 is 24. So that's what's in reference to. If down here under duration is coming up as frame numbers rather than time code, then if you just hit 24 times 5, 1080, I think. But 24 times 5 for now, and then we can switch it to time code right after this. So we're just going to hit OK. For background color, I would just recommend black. It's just going to be the color of the empty space behind your graphics. So I'm just going to hit OK. And you should have a blank screen here in the center. Your black rectangle may be larger or smaller. It may not necessarily depend on how large your composition is, especially if it was set to be the same size as mine. It just might be how closely we're looking at it, especially if it looks like it's zoomed in real tightly like this, where your black bar is taking up your entire composition. That just might mean that we're looking at it very closely. So you need not worry about that too much yet. If you do want to zoom in closer or further, you can roll your mouse wheel at the top of your mouse, or you can hold down Command and hit the minus key or the plus key, or you can go down here to the bottom left of the composition panel where mine says 50%. You can click on the little arrow to the right of it and you'll have many options. You can hit fit if you wanted to just fit snugly, or you can go inside and you can choose higher numbers if you want to zoom in more tightly. Okay, so at the bottom we have now on the far left we have a time code, and underneath we have the frames, and it says 24 FPS. FPS stands for frames per second. If yours is set in an opposing way, so the frames at the top and the time code at the bottom, and you don't want it to do that, you can hold down the Command key and click on it and it will flip. There's no right or wrong, either way is fine. I have a preference for the time code. And then over here at the far right side of the layers, for mine it's going to say 12F, 1, 112, 2, 212, 3, and that just means this is 0 seconds, half a second, 1 second, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3. Again, because the 12 is half of 24, and this is based on it being 24 frames per second. We are viewing the entire timeline from 0 to 5 seconds. I happen to just know that offhand because we made it 5 seconds long to start with. But you can also tell how close or how far you're looking into the timeline by looking at this little bar at the bottom. It looks like two mountains with a little scroll bar between them. And that allows us to zoom in and out of the timeline. So especially if we were working with a longer duration, like 30 seconds or even a minute or two, we may want to look for very particular numbers or placements in your timeline. So if you want to zoom in and get a better look, you can go down to these little mountains, left mouse down and drag to zoom in or out. Or if you want to zoom in more aggressively, you can tap on the large mountains to get closer and closer, or on the little mountains to get further and further. And it just zooms them in quicker and more quickly. If you ever want to know where you are on the timeline, that is indicated by the time indicator here. Kind of looks like a blue guitar pick with an vertical line pointing down, and you can just drag it around. And if you want to see exactly where you are, you can leave your time indicator and look over here to the left, and it says right now I'm at 1 second and 19 frames, so just under 2 seconds. Underneath here it will also say what frame I'm on specifically. So if we want to create a graphic, we're going to go to Layer, New, Shape Layer. And a shape layer is like a vector graphic, if you've ever worked with Illustrator. When you first click on it, you're going to get what looks like a little target in the center of the composition. A little layer has appeared, a little graphic that says Shape Layer 1 with a little star next to it, and a blue bar that runs across. And that just means the blue bar represents the duration of that particular layer. And because this is a shape layer, so a still image without its own set duration like a video, it's typically going to be the exact length of your composition unless that's been changed in the preferences. Now, even though there's a little dot in here right in the center, that doesn't mean that we actually have a graphic in here. It's just the representation of the placement of the graphic. We don't actually have a graphic yet. We're going to create a graphic by going up here to the toolbar, and we have some primitives in here that we can choose from. By default, mine right here is a rectangle. Yours might be a little different depending on the last person who used this file or used this program. If you want to use something other than a rectangle, you can left mouse down. So that just means holding the left mouse button down over that icon, and a little menu will appear with other options. I'm still holding down the left mouse button, and I'm going to grab the ellipse tool. Now when I want to select the ellipse tool, I just let go of the left mouse button, and now the tool has changed. Any tool up here that has a little arrow to the bottom right of that icon means that there are other options within that same tool, and usually all those options are related or part of the same tool. So this is the ellipse tool, which just means that it is a circle or an oval, depending on how I draw it. And so I'm going to go on here, and I'm going to left mouse down and drag. And right now it is a red circle with a black stroke. I just happen to know because of the fill and stroke options above the composition panel state that. Yours might be a different color, and that's okay. If you want it to be a perfect circle, which I do recommend, hold down the Shift key as your left mouse down and dragging, and it will maintain its proportions. When I want to let go, I just let go of the left mouse button, and that will place it in there. You may also notice that under the shape layer 1, under your layers here, there's now a contents, and underneath contents it says ellipse 1. Now you can hold multiple shapes under the same shape layer. So if I were to go through with the ellipse or the rectangle and draw something else, while the shape layer 1 is selected, it will add more shapes to it. You can do that, but just keep in mind that it is a little bit harder to control that way, especially if you wanted the shapes to be moved independently. So we're not going to do that right now. In fact, I'm going to close the contents because I don't want to do anything inside of the ellipse. So if you want to close the contents, you can go to the left of the word contents, and there is a little triangle pointing down, or a little arrow pointing down. When you left mouse click on it once, it closes the content, so ellipse is no longer showing. You can always bring it back later by clicking on it. And then underneath we have transform, and that's where we're going to be working with for the most part right now. If I do want to change the ellipse's color, I can do that up here at the top. Again, make sure that the layer is selected. I can tell the layer is selected because the name shape layer 1 is highlighted with a white box around it, and there's a little set of blue squares around the circle, and that just means that it is currently selected. So if I were to make any changes up here, those changes will be applied to my circle. So I'm going to click on the fill, which is red, and I'm just going to turn it to maybe a light blue. But you can change it to any color that you like. And I'm going to go over to stroke, and I'm going to get rid of the stroke. So a stroke is an outline. Right now it's a black outline, so black on black you wouldn't really see anything on here anyway. But you could change the color by clicking on it, and I can give it a white stroke so you can see it if you wanted to keep it. If you did not want to keep the stroke, there are a few ways that you can get rid of it. One would be to hold down Option and click until it has a gray box with a red line through it, and that just means absence of, so empty. And you can do that with the fill as well if you wanted it to have no fill. Another way to do that, I just held down Option and clicked on it again to bring the stroke back. Another way to get rid of the stroke is to go to the stroke width, which right now for mine is 5 pixels. I can click on the 5 and hit 0 on the keyboard and enter, and that will get rid of the stroke as well. Now any changes that I make in here are showing up down here because all the things that I'm doing to the ellipse are affecting these ellipse factors or information about the ellipse. But I don't really want to go in here any more than I have to, so I'm just going to close contents again. And I'm going to go to transform. So underneath transform are several different options that all have a little stopwatch to the left of them. If you have an attribute that has a stopwatch next to it, that means that it is an animatable attribute. That's important because it means that we can make changes to it across time. So going through each one, I'm going to skip anchor point for now. We are going to go back to it, but anchor point's a little bit more complex. Position is literal. It is the X and Y coordinates of our object, and that's what the two numbers to the right of it represent. The first number, 960, represents the X position, and the 540 represents the Y position. Those numbers might feel random, but there's actually a particular reason why the numbers start off that way. So, as mentioned before, when we first created the shape layer, there was this little dot, and it's still there. That dot is actually the anchor point. That is what After Effects considers to be the location of the shape, even though our actual circle's all the way a decent distance away from the anchor point. But the anchor point is where After Effects considers it to be. And especially if under contents we had created more shapes, you could have shapes all over. And it's this point right here that After Effects says, yes, this is where this graphic or set of graphics is located. So 960 by 540 is referring to its location, which is in the center. So the object, the whole composition size is 1920 by 1080. So if you divide that by half, which is, you get that number. So it's right in the center. If you wanted to move the position, you could do it in a few ways. One is you could take the selection tool near to the far left of the toolbar, and then you can click on the circle or the anchor point, or the circle, but be sure to click inside. Don't click the edges if you only want to move the position. These edges here, those little blue squares, are going to change the size if you wanted to change the size. And you may notice as I move it around, the two numbers here are changing. Now, the left and right numbers are going to change in a way that probably feels a little predictable. They go down as I move the circle to the left, and they go up as I move to the circle towards the right. This number might seem a little bit confusing. As I bring it down, the numbers go up, and as I bring it up, the numbers go down. In fact, if I were to go in here, because you can change the numbers directly, and hit 0, 0, the origin is not the bottom left, as you might expect, but actually the top left, which is more based on code. So if you want to change the position, that's just something to keep in mind. So we're going to change the position by moving the numbers. So I had clicked inside and typed numbers in, which you can do. But you can also hover your mouse over the numbers. Hovering just means that you're moving the mouse over it, but you're not clicking on any buttons on the mouse. The arrow turns into a finger pointing, and there's an arrow pointing left and right. Maybe a little hard to see. But if you left mouse down and drag, you can slowly increase or decrease the numbers. And this can be helpful if you're trying to do very precise movements. The arrow at the top, the selection tool, can be more helpful if you just want to manually move it. But moving the numbers can give you more precision, especially if you want to move it only horizontally or only vertically. You can also nudge with the arrow keys, left, right, up, and down. That's moving the position. Now, if you, I'm going to skip scale for a moment and just go to rotation, because that will be a little bit more literal as to a way that the anchor point is affecting the distance of the circle and the anchor point, and how it affects the animation. If you have rotation, you can change rotation by grabbing this curl that has an arrow on it, and if I left mouse down and drag, no matter where I grab on the circle, it's going to rotate the circle around the anchor point. And down here, you can see the degrees. And that's because the anchor point is the point of rotation. So this way would be helpful if we were working on a fan, like if this was a fan blade, or if this was spokes on a wheel, or a planet revolving around the sun. But let's say you wanted to rotate it from the center or from the edge. So it could be rotating as if it was hinged. So if we wanted to do that, and we just turn this back to normal by hitting 0, you may want to move the anchor point. And I mentioned rotation because it was a bit literal, but scale is actually going to work this way as well. If I were to grab a corner with the selection tool and drag, it looks like I'm moving it, but I'm actually not moving it. I'm scaling it. And you can see over here that the scale is being affected. The position is not being affected. So as I scale it, it moves further or closer to the anchor point. Now, if you are scaling with the selection tool, you can scale it non-uniformly. If you are scaling it by number, then it scales uniformly by default, but if you click on the checkbox or on the link, the constrained proportions, then you can scale it one at a time, vertically or horizontally. I'm going to change this back to 100, 100, so it's back to its original size. So that can be helpful to imply a zoom, so the object can look like it's moving towards or away from us if you have the anchor point away from the object. But again, just like with a rotation, it can be helpful if that's what you want it to do, but it can be not helpful if it's not what you want it to do. So if you want to change the anchor point's position, so the position of this compared to the circle, there are two ways to do it. One would be to grab the pan behind tool and click on your object. Make sure that you can see this. If you cannot see this, sometimes it won't show up, especially if you've just created the contents, like your rectangle or your circle, and this might not show up, or you might see another little anchor point inside. That's more in terms of like your contents, and sometimes it'll appear there. But if it doesn't show the way you're expecting it to, try clicking off and then clicking back on. And then if you have the pan behind tool, or it's also called the anchor point tool, you can left mouse down and drag it. Now you just got to be careful because when you're dragging this, It is moving the anchor point, but it's also moving the position, because remember, After Effects is considering the position of this ball to be where the anchor point is, not where the graphic is. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is you want to try to do this before you start animating. Once you start animating, especially if you have animated keyframes for the position specifically, moving it this way can cause a lot of problems, and you'd be better off doing it a different way. So if you wanted to do it a different way, and instead of using the pan behind tool, then you'll want to use the anchor point features here. So if I left mouse down and drag, what that will do is instead of moving the anchor point, I'm moving the ball, and the anchor point stays rooted. That's a little bit better if you've started animating because you're not putting in extra keys for the position. There you go. So now if you have the anchor point placed or moved, then try rotating again. And now as you can see, the rotation is behaving differently. It's rotating like a door on a hinge. And if I'm scaling, it scales, let's turn on the constraint, it's scaling from that point, anchored down at the anchor point. This can be really helpful when we eventually do squash and stretch. If you want the object to look like it's being squashed against something, that can be a good way to do it. Then you have opacity, which is the transparency of the object. 100% means that it is fully opaque, like milk. If you left mouse down and drag, it will become more and more invisible, more like water or like a ghost. And then at 0%, it's completely invisible. So that can be helpful if you want something to be on screen but not visible right away, and then have it fade in. That's a way that we can do it. So that is creating a shape layer and altering each of these points. If you want to rename your layer, the default idea might be to double click, but clicking on the name doesn't actually do anything in the software. There's two ways that you can do it. You can right mouse click and just right mouse click on it once. You don't have to hold the button down. And the little menu that appears, you can go to the bottom and it says rename. Another option is to click on the name and hit the return key on the keyboard. Now I'm going to change this name to linear, because that's how we're going to be moving this object. So I'm going to move the object up here to the top, and I'm going to pause this video and separate it from the others, because this is all about how to set it up. In the very next lecture, we're going to continue where we stopped here and start setting up the balls to move across the stage and setting keyframes.